So, Dr. Ken, thank you again for joining us today. One conversation with you simply wasn't enough. And while not everybody has the chance to take a number of courses with you, we do hope to have continuous conversation with you. So again, not everyone also knows the remarkable effort that you put to join us today, so I'd like to personally thank you for that. Now, I'd like to keep this conversation a little bit more casual than some of our other panels, and I'd like to engage the audience a little bit more as well. But to begin this, I'd like to have a little bit of rapid fire with you and just kind of allow people to get to know you in a little more, in a less structured way, a less casual way. So I want you to share a little bit with us about your experience. You know, being that you're an engineer, you work with policy people, you've had this diversity of experience that we've pointed to. What brought you into the field of data, and what was your journey, at least let's say in the early years, leading up to your first PhD?
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that I really enjoyed the last session. Where are the two speakers? Am I seeing the...
Dr. Sinan, Dr.
Yeah.
Ismail.
Wonderful.
I think Ismail left.
Dr.
Sinan is with us right now.
But, and I want to tie that a little bit together as we move through here. But I think one of the things that's happening is sitting here on my smartphone is going to be pushing that next generation. When you said the patient is going to demand it, so my wife's gone through a very serious medical thing, and now at UC Health, University of Colorado Health, you get your test results while sitting in the hospital before the doctors get them. And so the most amazing thing is if there's a T score that comes in, and then you get it, and they'll actually show it in a bar, and they'll give you the whiskers, and then shows your dot. I mean, it's a very creative dashboard. But then what does it mean? So my wife, her whole life, her T score was very low because this related to her thyroid, but it says it's normal, and we know it's not normal. It's normal for the population of the data. And so this personalized medicine is the key thing, you know. And then the other thing that happens is, as we're moving into healthcare, is just the other day being with my wife, I got a viral infection while being in the hospital. And so they rushed me to the ER. And I was sitting there almost crying because I work in the Middle East and Syria is on my heart. And I had $100,000 worth of tests. You know, a brain scan, a chest scan, you know, and for an American, that's okay, but where's this technology other places? How do we get it there? And then we use it so easily. So, I mean, but this whole idea, and I'm going to start this off backwards, I'm stealing some of your time, but it relates to you. The thing about policy is risk. The thing about humans is risk, and I was just dealing with that myself. What is the risk? And the number one thing policymakers are not trained in, and I think physicians are not well trained in yet, is probability and statistics, but then what's called the probability side, risk analysis. And the Kennedy School was founded by Howard Rafer, who was a specialist in decision analysis. So the whole idea of how we make decisions, if you think about it, it's based on risk. When you rent a car, do you take the extra insurance, the collision insurance? If you don't know, it's already on your credit card. So you're worried about that. All these, we take risks. We have to understand, what do statistics mean? That's the danger of big data, is if we just get more data but we don't know how to use them, we're going to make mistakes. So it's really important in communicating to decision makers what is risk and how do we use that in our life. And so that's sort of my main message to this group today. Big data is great. So now you get what we call long tails. We now understand that. But then how do you decide things? What do we do if we know there's a 10% chance by 2050 the UN will be flooded? Should we go spend money to build a wall to protect the UN from sea level rise in 2050? Now, we're rich here, we can do that. They spent $2 million in Boulder to put roads, to put bike paths underneath roads. With $2 million, what would we do in Mozambique? We could, you know, build so much. So when you go between cultures, your brain fries. But what should we spend money in Mozambique to develop hospitals, roads, other things? How do we bring this data in? And then the other part, which we want to make the link to the medical profession, is how do we link preventative work? We get a lot of money when there is disasters, right? That brings in the money, the telethons and things. What about nutrition? What about pit latrines, reducing diarrhea? We need more data to help policymakers understand that famous expression we have, an ounce of prevention is a pound of cure, or 100 grams, we're going to translate it for you, 100 grams for metrics. 100 grams of prevention is worth 500 grams of cure. How do we bring that in? How do we link people on the front line in the medical professions with the engineers who are designing systems? How do we make them accessible? And so one of the interesting things is we went to Ethiopia, and we went to a village, and they wanted to make these beautiful patterns to give them better food. So we were going to make cascades for them in the fields. And it turns out they didn't want that. What they wanted were roads. Why did they want roads? We said, don't you want food? Well, we can grow the food. If we don't have a road, we can't sell it. If we don't have a road, we can't get the seeds. But more importantly, with the roads, my children can go to school, and I can go to a doctor. So we have the whole message here is we don't have silos, we have integrated. So sustainable development, all those 17 goals are great, but most of them are clusters that we need to cluster. Water has to go with poverty, which has to go with food, which has to go with medicine and health. And if we break it up, we have to become specialists in it, but then we have to work together. So having this forum, that's why I came today. I flew out here just for less than 24 hours, because you're the next generation. You have to take this forward and bring it together. And the way I learned this you want to know, is when there's one thing you have to do, be very careful, is never eat ice cream and drink beer at the same time. Because when I did that in 1974, within 10 days, I was in Mali, West Africa, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, when I had to never further from my birthplace of Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Buffalo, New York was my furthest place I'd gone. And within 10 days, I went through Paris and was in Mali. And how many MDs in the room? We have one MD back, and we have a public health. What happens if you take immunizations to go overseas? You can't take gamma globulin for hepatitis, because live vaccine. So I went over to Africa without gamma globulin, and now I have Africa living in me forever, because I got hepatitis when I was there. So that, going there and never having been past Buffalo, and didn't even see the Niagara Falls that time, I've seen since, but I went to Africa as a 19-year-old, working and seeing poverty, seeing the idea that you can't bring technology if you don't understand the cultures, and then seeing the great importance for healthcare, preventative healthcare, and for infrastructure. And that changed my life. And so I came back and finished a degree. I'm called an engineer because I have a degree in engineering, but I'm not. I saw that technology is important and people need to build it and create and use it. But how we use it and the policies we implement to use it, and that directed me. So when I was 10 or 15 years in that work, I went out and got a master's in economics, because I saw economists were running everything. And if you go to the World Bank, the TTLs, the people who lead the project, are usually economists. And then the other thing I learned, I spent a lot of time, was making decision support systems. The thing about engineers, we're really nerdy. All engineers in the room, raise your hand. Okay. We're nerdy, right? We love numbers. And what we also do, we talk about probabilities. We like, Gaussian distributions and talk about those things. We go across the street or even here, policymakers don't want that. We need to communicate to policymakers about risk, but we as engineers and as people wanting to develop, we have to communicate at the level and in the manner of which the users of the information are there. So we love, when we're doing water quality, have these heat maps, they call them, of green going to dark red. People just want to know, because where is it good, where is it bad? And I'm going to make a policy. It makes engineers go crazy, but the world is digital. But on the other side is, don't underestimate policymakers. I was at a meeting once where the head of public works for San Francisco said, you guys can't handle the truth. That we really know what we want. You just have to learn how to communicate it to us in a way that we can use within the cultural setting. And that's why for climate change and other things, we need more creative things, but we don't need the day after tomorrow or whatever, where the snow on top of the, what was it, Statue of Liberty. You know, that causes more problems. And the other thing is we don't need to exaggerate. We don't need to make claims that are at the edge to scare people. We just have to talk about the truth and have the dialogue here. That's the other thing. So as you move, what it did, this is learning how to be policy, and that's why I spent at University of Colorado for 25 years teaching a course in water development that we welcomed students from the law school, the journalism school, the music school one time, and engineering. And all projects were, you had to be one from each of those schools working on them, and you had to do a real life project and bringing them together. And so there's the Knight Foundation for Journalists. How to get journalists to understand, because they're making the front line. And it's kind of funny, we're in the Scandinavian house. In the Nile Basin, there's quite a bit of controversy over something called the Gore, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam. And what the Swedish government has funded is bringing journalists from all the countries together to understand the problem. So I've worked with them so that they can communicate it to the population so they understand the real problem. So we have very, very complex systems. You know, the endocrine system of our body is really complex. But what does it mean? Should I take this medicine or not? And so bringing things together and teaching people, and this is the other problem is, but not being so wide that we're too narrow. We have to do things, we call it, people used to call it the T. You know, you have one expertise and learn something there. No, I call it the E upside down. We have to have a couple expertise as we go forward because the projects are so complicated, the things are so complicated. As we get to policy, we have to bring real data to it, but we have to learn how to communicate that. And that's sort of what took me there, the study on my own. And eventually, economists are pretty mean sometimes. If you know economics but you don't have a degree, they won't listen. So it took me 14 years, and I got the degree in economics to go along with my engineering degree. So
incredible. So much to build on. And number one, I smiled a little bit when you mentioned the GERD because that's pretty much the basis of our original relationship, where I learned about the GERD. I wanted to study it for my master's, and we talked about that for about 2 years. So very interesting experience, but also something that showed both of us, as well as the colleagues that we had, how to integrate a new framework that was coming out of the UN at the time, the Sustainable Development Goals, into a very complex subject matter, which is transboundary water diplomacy. How do you create peace and sustain it when multiple countries are in conflict over a very limited resource? So I want to pivot our conversation and focus a little bit more specifically on a topic emerging from this point, which is when you have folks who come from such diverse backgrounds as policy, engineering, economics, and ultimately the goal is how do we ensure countries or polities or groups of people in general can agree on a major issue that affects their livelihood, their energy resourcing, their political representation. When data is at the forefront, what is the best way to arbitrate and to mediate between these people when not everyone has this technical capacity to understand the data for what it is? How do you do so without exaggerating, like you said, but while meaningfully representing this data and the story that it tells to a diverse group of people?
Yeah, that's what I've dedicated a lifetime to. The issue is that you have to know where I sit so that you know where I stand on a topic. And this is the hardest thing. And we can talk about it in any kind of relationships, and I think if we did a survey, is the bias and the background that you bring to the situation influences how you even see data. I mean, we as engineers think you show you a probability distribution or we give you a number, that is absolute, but it isn't. I mean, I think we could, if you just raise your hand, how many could give us stories about that from your work, right? The hands are going. you say, this is what's happening. The same issue is on the GERD. You can say something, and the Egyptians will say it's this, and the Ethiopians will say it's this, and we're saying, well, those are the same numbers. How do you do that? So there are some things, which is why we need organizations like the United Nations, where we have to get, and I call it the level of trust. And so one of the things that happens, I think, is regional organizations where people invest in these organizations. And I'll give you a failed example, which is the Nile Basin Initiative. So the Nile Basin Initiative, to date, it's probably $30 to $35 million was spent. And all the nations, it grew because during the process, we had South Sudan and Eritrea adding to the number of basins, so 10 countries. And what they did was to develop a team of expatriates who were trained and living outside the Nile Basin that were world-class to come in and build a tool to manage the Nile River. So that it wasn't the British model, it wasn't the US model, it was a model built by the people there. They were there together for 10 years, training people and using the models and working together. However, what happened is that we broke down at a technical level, people could agree, but then during the time, the Ethiopians started the GERD, so Sudan and Egypt pulled out of the NBI. So the upper part of the Nile, they work together, but the big Nile issues can't be solved. And right now we still have the problem of different models being used, and there's a distrust of the other person's model. So when you have this, you have to start a ground level understanding of the technology at the technical level, building those relationships, while at the top having diplomatic activities going on. And then, if we are lucky, I mean, I've seen it a few times work, but then we have the merging between the two. One of those was acid rain in Europe, where the Germans and the British and the Benelux countries were polluting the atmosphere, and it was bringing acid rain to Scandinavia again. And so they got together, they went to an organization that was founded in Austria, which is an international one, built a model and made policy back. So the scientists from those countries agreed this was the scientific truth, and then the others did that. This is what the IPCC is trying to do, getting scientists from across all the countries to agree. We still have the data gap of the scientists from enough developing countries generating data being part of that analysis, but they are generally brought in. And then, as we know, we still have the global issue of trying, we just had this week here, of trying to get the top to work on it. But if we don't get the scientists to agree on the bottom, then that's another issue. And then just a climate science point. You're going to hear some things, and any journalists in the room? No? Well, we all read the newspapers at times. One of the things that happened one time is they had a debate in the Boston Globe. They had a climate denier and a climate science expert talk about climate change. Most people went away and thought most scientists are 50-50 on this topic, when it's not true. And the other thing is, again, this issue of who's saying what. If you ask climate scientists, people who spend their life studying it, 99% of them believe it's human caused that's doing this. There's 1%, one Dick Lindzen down the office from me, who's very strident about it, and that's great. If you ask all scientists, it's about 70%. And the reason is geologists don't believe in reality. I mean, they believe in looking backwards, right? And they're right. They've seen all these things in the past, and they just say, these are natural variations. And what the scientists say, we've never seen anything at this rate. So what people tell you, a scientist told me. Well, the scientists know nothing. I said, if you have brain surgery, do you go to a podiatrist? They're both doctors, right? Do you go to a cardiologist for your brain? No, they're all doctors. So we have to be careful who we listen to, and we develop this consensus, technical consensus, and we can disagree. And as I put out and we started, there's just a lot of uncertainty. And we have to be honest and humble about what we know and what we don't know, and then work through that. So that's part of the issue, I think, of how we can bring that, is at the technical person-to-person level, develop a trust so that I trust you would, what you say is what you believe. We may not agree with how to act on that, but at least the data is agreed to and trusted. And what happens if you work in, we have lawyers here, so you go to court and you get two people giving technical expertise as technical experts. The court, whether it's the jury or the judge, tries to judge who they feel is more credible. And so we want to get away from that and try to say the data is agreed upon. How we act on it, we can disagree because we have different values and different backgrounds. But we're not going to change that. Otherwise, it's a boring society. So how do we move forward?
Excellent question. Now, I have about 20 other questions that I would love to ask you, but time isn't really allowing for that. So I'll ask one more, and then I'll turn it to the audience for a little bit of crowdsourcing. My question is actually ironically based on a pretty narrow data set. Unfortunately, you've only won the Nobel Prize one time, but based on this data point, how could you infer that AI could be a reason for someone to win the Nobel Prize in the future? What do you want them to achieve to contribute to the benefit of humanity so that they would be deserving of winning the Nobel Prize for their work in AI?
Okay, so Ramy there's two people sitting right now up at the front. Ramy for lying and me for enjoying it. So the Nobel Prize, I have to put a disclaimer. There were 4,000 of us that won it. And Al Gore. The organization, the IPCC won it, and they did send us a poster which is hidden in my office, and my grandkids look at it and it says, so thank you. But
if I could add, one time when I went to your office, you had two really important documents framed, but on the floor collecting dust. One of them was your PhD from MIT in economics, and the other one was a Nobel Prize. So just letting you guys know, some people here are pretty humble.
So just because we're having fun, we just moved to a new house, and last Sunday, a week ago, my wife insisted in my new office, she had them framed and we hung them on the wall. But however, my healthcare, my wife developed tachycardia when she lifted the book up, so now we had to go to the emergency room. And I learned more about medicine, so we were, so interestingly enough, I don't think there's AI in computation. And the other thing is, I'm using the forum, I'm not answering these questions, I'm on my mission here, but I'm using it so he can't fire me, he can give me lunch. We have to be careful, I think, when we talk about AI, and I heard somebody say it earlier, everybody thinks AI is robots and HAL and all of those kind of things. Your cars probably have more AI than anything. I have a Honda won't let me take a right-hand turn because it's doing that, but I love it. I have blind side control and these things. So AI is a whole range of things. And it's artificial intelligence. I think it should be assisting intelligence. AI is just a tool. So when we talk about big data, where's my friend who's a statistician? It's just the same tools doing it a lot more and gathering more data. Our work with, the stuff on the genomes and that stuff, having computing power is amazing. So I think some people in physics have won prizes for, what's his name from MIT, Forster, who got a prize for doing that. So what we need to do is just use these tools. Use these tools in a way that are good for humanity. I want the Nobel Prize to be won in peace for figuring out how to not lose our dignity and our all the things that we're hearing about with the misuse of data. How do we use these tools? So I think making faster computers so that we can process things at the same time we make faster computers for processing. We can do face recognition more. You can check all my credit cards and figure out where I've been. So all this technology is good and evil. And so how we can get some moral structure to what can be incredibly difficult, that's where I want it to be, is something that we can learn how to use these tools in a way. And I would say most of the problems in the developing world could be 50% solved if we just were, to use a good Boston term, wicked generous. And if we all gave, there is a model called the tithe, and the average people who say they tithe, it's 2%. They don't give 10, it's average in that community that believes in the tithe, it's 2%. If we gave 10% to development, or we reverse some of the policies that are going on now, and we use our foreign aid not for geopolitics, but for aid, those kinds of things, that using the tools that are there would be helpful. So we need to, I think, figure out how to help development and use these tools in the right way, because they're there. And I've already spoke to a number of people doing wonderful things. How do we use drones properly, right? We can use drones poorly. We can use them for good. How do we use that? So it's bringing, I guess, and this is part of my view, is bringing some sense of morality to development and technology. And how do we do that? And so I studied theology on the side, and my wife has a degree from seminary. And without becoming a theocracy, but how do we bring spiritual and morality to our decisions as a society where we put humans first? And that's a very broad issue, including refugees, including unborn, all different things. How do we have dialogues on that without killing each other? And that we work together. That's the thing that I see as the problem. When I go overseas, some people's solution to population is solely abortion. Others, they talk about it and then don't do anything. And then I see people taking care of orphans or whatever. How do we come and work together in a pluralistic society, in a multi-faith society, in a way that benefits society? I don't know, that's the issue. I mean, because I can go pay somebody here to build a faster computer. They're coming up with quantum computers, and if I had the money, I could do what I needed. But that's the kind of thing I think we need to do, is push ahead. But there's so many restrictions, and we're becoming, not just in our country, but as I travel, we're becoming so polarized. We have to break that down within regions, within countries, to solve that.
Phenomenal. Now, we're going to open the floor to questions, but because we are a little bit behind time, the way we're going to do it is we're going to take 3 questions at once, and Dr. Strzepek will answer each of the 3 together. So, first question, please.
Great. Dr. Ken, so quick question. Since you are a water resource expert and environmentalist, I came across research, I think within the last year or so, that 90% of the world's fish, with the increasing population that we have, continue to be protein-based human consumptions. Can you share your thoughts in terms of any sort of technology that you see, whether it's cell-based or plant-based companies that's really making progress in that space? First of all, I think 2 parts of the question. Number 1 is, do you believe in these technology that will sort of replace what we can, or substitute of fish? And number 2 is, any companies that you see are making really great progress on this thing?
Okay, so just to recap, the first question is, are there technologies to replace our meat and fish consumption, and which players are winning in that space? What's the second question? The lady with the glasses? That's you. You don't look behind you. Yeah.
So we briefly spoke during the break, and I think one of your concerns.
Louder voice, please.
Sure. We briefly spoke during the break, and one of Dr. Kent's concerns was with the generational change across industries. You were worried that a lot of the institutional knowledge was kind of leaving the field. So if you were to arm sort of this next generation, where are your deepest concerns in terms of that institutional knowledge that we're not capturing quickly enough?
Okay, so the idea is how to arm tomorrow's generation with the institutional knowledge that is depleting today.
Or more so, specific areas that you think where the institutional knowledge is not being captured by technology, and we need to kind of rush towards that, specific industry or area within water management or climate change to kind of capture that.
Excellent, thank you. And one third question, gentleman with the blazer.
So I really appreciate your emphasis on risk. I spent 30 years as a risk manager, so that's great. And communication is absolutely key. Uncertainty is key. So the question is about a risk metric that includes uncertainty. So you can do this because you can put whatever uncertainties there are in climate sensitivity, which is what you were talking about with Richard or whatever it is. You can, with sufficient computing power, build a set of scenarios which includes all of these uncertainties, and then what to accept here is the confidence level in the distribution that corresponds to that risk appetite. So the risk tolerance level itself is a policy decision, but the number depends simply on the computation. So my question is that something that you think is a reasonable thing to do?
All right. So in other words, can we provide a window of how much risk a policy person should be willing to accept, and then how best to act on that with the technologies available? Perhaps I missed it. I don't want to misquote you.
I think I can. Yeah. It's a little bit nerdy question, but we will make it broader answer. Okay, let me go back to the fish. To answer that, my two brothers are famous fishermen. One lives on Connecticut on one side of Long Island Sound, and one lives in New York. And they have seen in the last 5 years the striped bass population plummeting. And one of the problems is, so this is related to management. And one of the most famous of all sustainable development work, and if you read Bill Clark's book on sustainability, it's in there, who was his co-advisor at Harvard, it is about managing fish stocks. So we know what to do. It's the tragedy of the commons problem. So what we're doing is, you've seen all the work on plastic, we're polluting the oceans. The Gulf of Mexico, we're polluting because, so we ought to be careful when we say, oh, let's go make vegetables. And the good news now is Burger King has the Impossible Burger. Did you know that? It tastes like the other burger. Take your friends, switch it up, you can't even tell. So, but to get that low-cost vegetable, we pollute like crazy the Mississippi River system with fertilizers and pesticides, which are ending up in the Gulf of Mexico, and we're getting hypoxia there. So it's always a trade-off. So what is the worst thing? So we need to look at how to balance things. And I'm not an expert on fish, but I'm an expert on water use and diet. And so for an example, did you know that a Coca-Cola uses 10 times as much water as beer? Because Coke has sugar in it. And if it's corn syrup sugar, it's irrigated corn, so that uses a lot of water, where if you make beer the way the Germans did, you just throw hops in the water. So there was a Swiss report that said, drink beer, not Coke. There's many reasons for not doing that, or not drinking either of them. But the issue is looking at the diet. If all the Chinese right now eat 2 more eggs a day, that's going to change the whole world. If they go to adding meat in their diet. So it affects climate change from emissions as well as water, our diet. So that is an important issue there that we need to look at, which is very complex. And how do we tell people what to do? And we need to be volunteer, and we need to educate, which is there. The other thing about institutional knowledge, one of the things that's happening in climate change is seed companies. You know, we've heard about GMOs, and that's a really good discussion sometime to talk about that. But seed companies are now storing seeds away there's a couple in Norway and other places where it's cold, because we need the germplasm, because they may be the way to produce the food later when the climate has changed to something we haven't seen. So that institutional knowledge. The other thing in Africa particularly is, what is the indigenous knowledge of how we dealt with droughts before? So there's a lot of things on how we survived before. How can we use that? The problem is, we're bringing in, and this is the word I use, Eurocentric lifestyles to African-centric worlds. And it's a clash. And my friend from South Africa, that's the whole point, is it's a little bit aside, and I'm pushing institutions, but I have a really good friend who worked in the foreign ministry. And as soon as the ANC took over the foreign ministry, it acted like a tribe system, where your cousin was appointed. It wasn't immoral. As a Westerner, we thought that was immoral. And he realized what it was. It was Afrocentric view versus Americentric view. They now have switched it back, and he is second in command. He stayed there for 30 years, said, this is my country, and I'm leaving. But you understand, it's our viewpoint affects things. So getting history of how we did things, and even not just technology, but biology, how do we preserve these things so that we can adapt? Unfortunately, I spend a lot of my time in working on climate resilience, which is going to the final problem, is we're going to adapt to a changed climate. We are changing the climate. How much is the question? So how do we adapt to that? That adaptation needs to come from historical things as well as things we're going to generate. And when we generate new things, there's dangers. GMOs have dangers, but they're high yielding. We have other dangers that we bring in. There's unintended consequences. So bringing that indigenous knowledge, particularly in areas that haven't been well studied, to bring that back. And some aren't compatible with a modern life. And so we have to make those choices, which are hard. And then the last thing is, what he asked about is what I spend about 60% of my time every day is, we are making development decisions through World Bank funding, through local funding, through UN funding, through USAID. We are building development projects, roads, infrastructure in cities. We're going to hear about smart cities. And so the question becomes, we always design our drainage for what's called the 100-year flood. That's been a standard that was established, and we're not quite sure it should be the same every year, but that's a separate issue. But if we have the 100-year flood, the 100-year flood in 2050 in Cambridge, Massachusetts is going to be the 1 in 10-year flood in 50 years if things continue. So Cambridge, Massachusetts has decided that you will build to the 1 in 100-year flood that we expect to be in 2070, not the one that we look backward on. The city of Lexington, Massachusetts, home of the famous start of the Revolutionary War, they said, we're not going to look at 100 years to design our system. We're going to look at the last 30, which means one more inch for flooding there. So this idea that the past represents the future, we have to change that. So the only way to do that is with Monte Carlo statistics and doing a lot of big data, but big computing. So we can come up and now tell you the risk of the level of the Hudson River. The question then becomes, and I was involved with after Katrina, after Hurricane Sandy, which was an extreme event, how do we design the next system? For Sandy to come again? For a double Sandy? What can we afford? Those decisions are culturally sensitive. So in the Netherlands, they've gone to the 10,000-year flood because they're below ground and they're sensitive to that. In most of Africa, on the books, is the 1 in 50-year storm, not the 1 in 100-year storm, because they can't afford it. But they never even build to the 1 in 50. So just putting into place. So what do we do? How far can we look in the future? And there's a concept in economics called discounting, which is the opposite of compounding. So $1 to me in 50 years is less than now. And that's really bad because that's that intergenerational issue. We care less about our grandchildren than we do about our children and about ourselves. So how do we have this intergenerational? And there's even one person who won the Nobel Prize, Tom Schelling, in economics, who said some of our total focus on climate change is almost racist because we have problems in most of the world, non-white now, with development, and we're not worrying about that. We're worrying about, will there still be snowing in Aspen so we can ski in 100 years? We have to take into account this intergenerational. And I'm coming back again, and this is what's really hard. And we saw a bunch of people who are going to be speaking at the General Assembly and whatever. It's about values and morals, and how do we bring that into it? And that's what that is with risk. What is the risk I'm willing to take to prevent something from happening? And the poor don't even have that luxury. They live with the risk that others have put on them. So we protect the floodplain, but then the poor in La Ceiba, Honduras, who have nowhere else to go, they build their homes on the levees we built for the floodplain, so when the flood comes, they get killed because we don't give them proper housing. And then the rich build on the coastline, and then we spend money to protect the rich houses when they shouldn't be there. So, I can go on and on those stories, which are how do we do it? And then the last question that's really hard is no one left behind is a nice word, but we can't do it. To spend the money so that one person, this doesn't happen, we're going to have no money for anything else. So we have to live with the largest number of people that we can do good for. And that's hard to do. And so how do we do that in public health, in education, and all of those things? And my last thing as a water person, if I don't get to say anything else, is building schools for girls in Africa and the developing countries is much more important than anything else you could do. That's... It is the key on which everything else is built, because when you have public health and you have diarrhea, you have to keep hydrating, which doesn't make sense unless you know how to read and you know how to do doses. And we can bring all the water we want, but if we don't do that, how do we bring it there? And we're working on institutions again to kick the men out of the Water Users Association because the women do the irrigation. So those gender issues, but particularly getting girls, because there are girls educated everywhere, but particularly in Africa is an issue, and in developing country, that's where we need to start. If we have $1, that's where I spend it.
Phenomenal. So not only is AI a very human experience, but it needs to be approached in an interdisciplinary, cross-cutting way. Dr. Strzepek, thank you so much for joining us today. Dr. Ken will be around for a few more moments. We're going to transition shortly into our lunchtime period in programming. But thank you again for joining us all the way from Colorado. And let's give it a round of applause for Dr. Ken Strzepek.